chat already, which is great. And I know we have Bryan here in the background too. He'll jump off mute and turn his cam off right now. Good cue, Bryan. All right, so welcome to another episode of Talking Talent. If this is your first time joining us, I'm Britt and this is Jay, and we are your hosts from Video My Job. And if you're a returning attendee, then thanks for coming back. So before we jump in, just a little bit of housekeeping. Today we're using the software Riverside. If you've never used it before, you can actually manipulate your view, and you can minimize Jay and I if you don't want to look at us and you just want to let Bryan take over the screen, which I strongly encourage. You can do that in the top corner of your little view. Great. And we're also going to be using the chat. So like I said, there's a couple of people already chatting in there. If you want to drop in an emoji so you know that it works, that'd be great, because best question of the day actually gets one of these kits, which has a few filming gadgets in there, some jelly beans, some socks, and I think that's it. So strongly encourage you to use the chat today.
Cool. And just a couple of call outs before we jump in, Britt. So the first one is, thanks again to Simone from Sportsbet from our last session. Not only did she manage to, on the fly, switch over from Riverside to Zoom, but still spit some really good wisdom and some really good takeaways that, people were loving after the session. The second one is, we're about to launch our totally new Talking Talent newsletter at the end of the month as well. So that'll have a range of updates from the most recent episodes, like the one today with Bryan, news, and also contributions from the community. So that'll be hosted on LinkedIn. So if you're keen to subscribe to that, our producer Paul here is going to drop that in the chat now as well. So just a couple of call outs before we get into it.
Awesome. Cool. Well, let's talk about today's episode. We are so honored to be joined by Bryan Chaney. So Bryan has a whopping 18 years experience in the industry, which is huge. He's currently the Director of Employee Branding at Workrise. He's also the co-founder of the Talent Brand Alliance, which is one of the first, I think, EB communities creative of its kind. So we're really excited to have him here today. And thanks so much for joining us, Bryan.
I'm happy to be here. Happy to see y'all. I'm gonna call out to everybody. Y'all can minimize me and look at y'all. I think that's probably the preferred route for myself anyway. And so, personal tip: if you've got Zoom fatigue, or if you're used to going into meetings, one of the first things that I always do when I hop into a meeting is I minimize my own personal video, like my self view, so that keeps me from focusing on what I look like. I don't know if y'all have any tips for focusing on the meeting at hand and engaging with people, but that's a big one for me. I'm excited to be here, and almost 18 years of experience in employer brand, talent brand. So many different things have happened over the span of that career. Quite honestly, for the first probably 5 or 6 years, I didn't really understand, and I wasn't fully into what I was doing. I was doing a job and I understood it and I was focused on it, but I didn't realize how much of an opportunity there was to focus on this career track. So for me, I always love hearing how people get into it. It's a bit similar to how people got into recruiting, and I think there's always a good story there.
Yeah, amazing. So before we jump into it, I'll just give everyone a bit of an overview of the topics we're diving into today, because we do have a fair bit to get through, but there is still time to obviously answer any questions that are dropped in the chat. So the first topic we're going to talk about is, obviously we want to chat about TBA, as well as around this idea of the employer brand skill gap, Bryan, and I guess any advice you have around how ambitious talent experts, perhaps on the call, can really differentiate themselves in the space. Then the second topic is the idea of employer brand damage control and your personal experience navigating this. And then finally, we'll get to exploring how to pivot and adapt your employer brand strategy if hiring slows down and perhaps, the needs of the business do change on the fly. So how's that sound? That
sounds great. And just to kick it off, the Talent Brand Alliance didn't exist before, in December of 2012, I bought the domain name. So understanding, and that's talentbrand.org for those of you who are at home wanting to check out TBA. I did that with a friend of mine and fellow co-founder, Will Staney. And so we realized that we were looking for a place to learn from other people who were doing this work. We said, where do these people live? What are they, where are they working? What's their job title? How can I understand how to do my job better? And it just wasn't there. So we decided that we would dig in and we would create it. We let it, like many good things, on the back burner. It tends to sit for a minute or two. And so we fully kicked things off in 2015 and launched a community. We tried a few different platforms. So it's less about the platform itself. There's a couple of ones. There's a standalone community at talentbrand.org, but there's also there's a Facebook group where a lot of discussion happens, and it's not just around. There are a lot of places where you can post a comment and hope that somebody will respond with the right answer or their perspective. And this is really around having the right people in the room. So for us, having a vetted community was really important. Number one, because we wanted to learn from people doing the work. But number two, there are salespeople, vendors. There's who many of them have great intentions, but when you think about and also, by the way, just recruiters, people who just want to learn about the career path, about what it takes, because I've heard from many people that they consider it to be probably the most fun part of recruiting for some people. Just to understand what you get to do. You get to tell stories. You get to create visuals. You get to show up in different ways to engage the people that we live and work around. And so I think for us, having that experience is a way to add value from day one. So the individual members are vetted, people request, and about 60% of them are admitted into the community. You're a practitioner, you're doing the work, and you could be doing the work in-house. You could also be doing the work for a client company. So you don't have to be just in-house, but you have to be doing the work. So if you're a salesperson, that doesn't necessarily qualify you for the work. But if you're a recruiter, and especially if you're a recruiter at a smaller organization, you're probably the only one tasked with the project work because no one else is there on the payroll with that skill set or that focus. And so you need a place to learn. And so we ask those questions too. We're very mindful in how we screen people. We want to make sure that we're open, because the way that we continue to grow is by making more people who do this work.
I want to ask you a few more questions about Talent Brand Alliance, but I just want to take you one step back first. So obviously we were talking before about how you have been in the employer brand industry for 18 years. So you've obviously led the employer brand function for companies like Twilio, for Indeed, and now at Workrise.
Yeah.
Can you share, I guess, like what's the hook that has kept you in the game for so long?
So I'll share. I was talking to someone early last year, and they were at a big tech company named after a piece of fruit, and I was talking to them about a potential role at the company, and the guy said, "Wow, you've really been doing this work for a long time." Like that, but what came across there was, number one, I think the fact that he didn't really care for the work, but that he was surprised that there was somebody who really enjoyed it enough to focus on it, to make it their specialty. And for me, the absolute best part of my job is hearing people's stories and understanding that everybody has a story worth telling. We don't often realize that. We often don't get the opportunity to do that. And for a lot of companies, it's the best form of recognition that they can offer their employees is to elevate and to share their stories with other employees, but also with the outside world. What are we doing? How are we telling this story? Who's got an experience of working at this company that tells what we're about, that shows the opportunity and the experience that we create? Helping people feel validated and heard and that their stories are worthy. That's my favorite part.
I love that. Yeah, viewing storytelling as like a recognition tool.
Yeah,
I like that.
Yeah, that sounds good, Brian. I mean, when I meet new people or new colleagues coming to the business, I genuinely love unpacking what was the arc of kind of their career. How did they move from one thing to the next? Which parts were expected or planned? How did they pivot? So to do that as a job for and kind of get paid for it and enjoy that sounds pretty awesome.
Yeah, sounds like a good place to be. Now, Brian, I just want to.
Well, you have to love people. That's the aspect of being a marketer. You have to love people and understand that sometimes people are going to bore you, but sometimes they're going to tell you stories that are amazing, and you have to be on board for both.
Yeah, people person. Okay, so taking you back to Talent Brand Alliance, so you're obviously saying before, you gave us a little bit of context about when it was created, why it was created, how it's a vetted community, and why that's really important. But I'd like to ask you about how have you really seen the needs of the community evolve over, the last few years in particular, and perhaps if you're seeing that move in any kind of clear direction as we kind of look forward.
Yeah, I've seen a lot of movement, and to be honest, there's the same group of people who find out about TBA, who join, who have the same basically 5 or 6 questions that they'll post and they'll ask. And so we've created some knowledge resources that kind of give people, hey, you might want to ask these questions. Here's where you go first, or here's how you search within the conversations. And so that's just in seeking out knowledge. And one of the things that I've seen change over time is the level of maturity of the questions that people are asking. So we've gone from how do I get sign off for creating an Instagram account, all the way to how do I get headcount, and how do I tell the story of how my audiences overlap with the audiences of marketing, so that we can share budget and mind share and channels and all these other things. So there's definitely a maturity level that's grown over time. And I also think over the past few years, particularly in the pandemic, when jobs went away for a short period of time. Remember that back in 2020 when there were some when there were some layoffs and there was a lot of uncertainty, and not there's not any uncertainty now. But what happened was companies, one of the first things that companies do when there's a lot of uncertainty, or when they're not sure when the business is going to do, is they'll cut TA. They'll cut TA, which in a lot of organizations is inclusive of recruitment, marketing, employer brand. If you don't know if you're going to hire, the quickest way to save money is to cut your recruiting team. So that happened a lot in 2020. And we went from 2020 with a lot of uncertainty to 2021, where organizations realized that they were going to be hiring, and they panicked, and they all were trying to hire recruiters back. And they realized that recruiters were a lot harder to come by. And so they panicked, and they started paying their recruiters more and more money. As you may or may not remember, in 2021, there were buckets of cash being thrown at recruiters and recruiting leaders. And we went from, okay, we can't hire any recruiters because we can't afford the recruiters. So now what? Now what do we do? Or we've hired some recruiters and we need more. We know that we have competition. So they started hiring specialists, or social media people, or recruitment marketing specialists. So what they started was, they said, okay, well, look, I'll give you a head count, and it'll be at this level. And we went from that for a period of a few months to understanding that what they thought the person was going to be doing was well below what they actually needed. So the knowledge in the market just wasn't there. And there was this time, about 6 months, that it took for organizations. I would watch, because I pay attention to companies that are hiring. I pay attention because I want to share those opportunities with the rest of the Talent Brand Alliance. But I also pay attention to the types of roles. So if they're hiring a specialist in March, and in October they're hiring a director, it's because they thought they could get away with somebody who just knew how the function worked, and they didn't really understand how to speak to it or the real business value. So they got somebody in, they're like, oh, we need somebody who can actually present to the executives too. Okay, great. So you got to go back to the drawing board and hire a different skill set. So I saw that happen across 2021. And so a similar growth has happened across TBA membership. And that's the elevation of the kinds of questions that we have and the kinds of concerns. There's probably, I'd say, 3 to 5 questions every single day posed by members within the Talent Brand Alliance. And it's just asking, like, how do I do this? What's that? What have you done? Do you have a template? Can anybody meet to discuss how you looked at an employee advocacy tool, or a lot of things along those lines? That's a lot of how it's changed. And I think we've become cognizant that there are levels now. An employer brand program manager or employer brand manager is not an employer brand manager in every company or corporation. The skill sets are very, very different. Some people have been doing this for 13 months. Some people have been doing it for 13 years. So it's understanding that with that added time and with that reliance on the skill set, we have to get more complex and more advanced with how we help and support the community.
Yeah, amazing. Jay, I might throw to you for the next kind of section.
Yeah, so we understand, because Bryan, you were talking about before how TBA is.
I'm still waiting for the Ron Burgundy chats, by the way.
Yeah.
You were saying before about the like the parameters or the requirements of TBA. You guys like to set the bar fairly high, or like to keep it pretty tight. And so you mentioned before about vendors. Of course, you got to keep those cheeky vendors out. You never know what we're going to do if we get in there. But if there's somebody on this call who doesn't quite meet those parameters for TBA the way you think about it today, but they do want to move in that direction from an employee brand standpoint or career-wise, where's the best place for them to go? In your view, like, where should they start to build up that capability before they're ready to move into something like TBA and that stage of their career?
So first, I'll say that there's a lot of things, a lot of resources that we provide as TBA that are public, that are publicly accessible. Everything from our survey results to the blog posts to specific events and webcasts that we do. Those are available to the general public. But there are a lot of other resources around books specifically. So there's The Talent Brand by Jody Ordioni. There's The Give and the Get. There's even, I'll even do a throwback to Lars Schmidt's Employer Branding for Dummies, which is several years old, but still very, very good in the content. There's a lot of content out there. And for us, one of the reasons why we wanted to be vendor agnostic was because most of the content that was out there when we originally founded TBA was specific to a vendor initiative. So it was, here's how to think about employer branding as it relates to using our platform, our product, our service. And while some of that stuff is good, you have to filter through it. So you have to ask yourself, okay, what's the angle for this? How can I educate myself? And there just weren't a whole lot of independent sources of knowledge out there. So for us, we're actually actively building, and this hasn't been announced anywhere else. We're actually building a certification program and an education curriculum for people who want to learn, because we realize that that's our best route to growing and to adding more EB practitioners.
Okay, cool. Yeah, great. Really good checklist there. And then I suppose further to that, like this question was originally intended around, okay, well, somebody who might be in that more of a talent generalist, as you were kind of describing before, the difference between the generalist and specialist type roles, and want to move in there in that direction towards EB. Is there any opportunity for them to kind of differentiate themselves, or an area that they could focus on the way in that would help them stand out, like that, a skill or a capability that's just not in abundance today at the norm within EB that you would like to see people think about bringing into the community proactively?
So storytelling is a skill set that's never really going to go away. But when you think about that, there are elements that you can focus on. You can focus on learning marketing skills, learning writing. There are so many things, and as anybody who's ever looked for a job online will tell you, that job advertisements are the best cure for insomnia, because people don't prioritize good writing skills. So I wholeheartedly recommend Everybody Writes by Anne Handley. It's a book that's out there to really democratize and demystify the writing process. So understanding writing skills to get to the building blocks of story, and then also to understand that most of what we use has come from a marketing background. So whether that's visual design, whether that's thinking about how to describe story angles, focusing on audiences, that's a lot of the day to day. The elevated pieces are really around understanding the challenges that leaders are facing. If you ask leaders specifically what qualities they want to see in the people that they're going to hire, and they'll tell you, like, oh, I'm looking for this, I'm looking for that, I'm looking for, okay, great. Well, what's the danger? What's the business value in not being able to communicate the kind of person that you want to hire, or the kinds of people that you want to hire? Yes, absolutely correct in the chat. I told you, Ron Burgundy. But if you understand that a leader's challenges are going to be focused on not just sentiment, not just your Glassdoor ranking, but also on your ability to attract and engage the people that are going to help that leader achieve those business goals. That's the skill set. So understanding business and understanding how bringing the right people in the door is going to help that business leader achieve those business goals. I know that's really, really high level, but that's one of the best ways that I can think about communicating the value and understanding how to think about employer brand, because it's not just about the marketing. It's not just about the cupcake pics on Instagram. It's not just about the TikTok videos. It's about how you can engage people across the channels that they're using to tell really good stories. What they think is a good story will change over time, and where they see those stories is going to change over time. So it's a matter of being able to do that wherever the audience sits.
Cool. Yeah, I love that. There's definitely a few items in there as well, Bryan, that resonates with me from like a marketing standpoint. I mean, one of your points before around the vendor kind of narrative of, okay, well, this is the strategy you should use because that's what our platform supports. There's a big movement in the marketing space more holistically around trying to move away from that and get more customer centric. And then in terms of, that content creation skill side of things, I think, one of the movements I've seen in the marketing space more broadly is to try to bring as much of that capability directly into the team. Like that's where the best content is created, when that rather than using an agency or outsourcing that to somebody that's not living and breathing the understanding of that audience you want to engage with.
The content creation has been democratized. And that's one of the great ways that you can learn how to tell a story is by practicing, because TikTok is free. Instagram is free. Experimentation and storytelling are free. All of those things, this thing that we have in our pockets, it's not free, but you've already bought it.
So true. Well, that's a big takeaway. Just start practicing. If you're sitting on this call being like, where do I get started? Just get started with storytelling. Awesome. Let's dive into the next topic because we still have a fair bit to get through. So Bryan, looking at some recent headlines, there's been something like 34,000 people laid off in the tech space in the US alone. And we have also seen that that's started to move through Australia as well in the last few weeks. So there's likely some people on this call who have been either directly or indirectly affected by this. We know, Workrise also experienced this earlier this year. So really keen to understand what's your take on how this affects someone in employer brand role, and if they're being currently affected or they have been. by the layoffs?
Yeah, and we throw a lot of numbers around. In the U.S. specifically, there have been over 50,000 this year alone of people impacted by layoffs. Obviously, that's just U.S. That's not global. But there are a lot of companies seeing opportunity to right size, an opportunity to predict and try to prepare themselves for the uncertainty. And so some of those are good decisions, some of those are convenient decisions. And I'm not here to judge, but what I am here to do is talk about what you can do, because you're not in control of most of the people aren't in control of that decision, but you are in control of how you react. And when you think about our role as employer brand, most people sit within a talent attraction or recruiting function, right? That's the general assumption. Some people in a much larger organization will be split between brand and recruitment marketing, and so they might sit under the global brand or global marketing team, and you've got a talent attraction or advertising function to drive traffic for recruiting. But for the most part, they sit within TA, talent acquisition, talent attraction, and about 80 to 90% of the focus is external. Why? Because you're trying to hire people who don't work there. So you're taking that message, you're curating, taking that message over to your external audience. And I think for me, the rest of that ratio is actually internal. Think about internal comms, employee stories, how you think about curating them, where the experience is. Think about recognition. And when something happens like this, where you're not hiring or hiring is reduced, you have to flip that. You really have to flip that ratio of exposure and take that inside, take that internal, because you have to figure out what's going on. You have to ask questions and understand that engaging people is going to give you the answers. And I can share for me, the big shift was in conducting some focus groups and understanding that our challenge was in saying, okay, we're not hiring right now, so how can we use this to assess the mood, assess the uncertainty, the questions, the fear, the stress, the anxiety, all the things that are going on whenever there's major changes. So for us, we actually did a series of focus groups aimed at a few different things. One, it was understanding where we were culturally, because there's a lot of change, and it seemed to be constant change up to that point. So it was, where are we, so that we can know where we need to go and what are the things that we need to do. So it was asking about, what do you care about now? What's different now? Because before, you were probably like, okay, I'm looking at the things that are at the top of that priority pyramid, right? Whereas when things change like that at a fundamental level, you're like, okay, now what? Is my job safe? What else is happening? How am I secure and stable in my role? And it was interesting to see that shift, and we asked a lot of questions. So one of the things that we learned was that people need a space to be validated and to be heard, and we gave them that space. So an example of those focus groups, we started at 90 minutes, and the very first focus group we had actually ran over 3 hours because people wanted to share more. They wanted to share what was going on. They wanted to voice concerns, not just because they wanted leadership to be able to hear them, but also because what they wanted to do was understand that the other people who were involved in those focus groups had a lot of those same concerns and worry. And it was, okay, I'm not alone. So there's a question in the chat, was leadership present in the focus groups? So the answer is no. I had the benefit of only having been at the company for 6 months while conducting them. So it was almost like I was, brand new, in that I didn't have a whole lot of this background. And so I came to it just with a tell me. I'm here to understand. I'm here to learn. Tell me what's been going on. Tell me where the challenges are. And we were very mindful in that process so that we didn't have people above a certain level within the organization participating, because what ends up happening there is the gravity of that person's role and responsibility affects the sharing from the people in that group. The groups, by the way, were small, 5 to 8 people apiece. And so very intimate, but we also made sure that the people didn't have a reporting structure. I think there was only 1 or 2 examples where there were exceptions to this, but we were very mindful not to have you sit there and ask for you to spill your thoughts and concerns in front of your manager. So there were a lot of dynamics that we took into consideration. But what we did was we realized people needed a place to be heard. Leadership needed a vessel for that communication, and we needed to show action. So we've actually taken all that feedback. We had almost 100 pages of notes, and we turned that into our organizational health index. So what would have been an assessment tool externally is now, okay, how are we assessing this? How are we communicating this? And how are we providing that communication back to our employees and kept it internal? So everything that you would do, it would be very similar to how you would create an employer value proposition. And so the questions that we asked heavily overlapped there. So what are the things that you look for? What brought you here? What keeps you here? And what are the challenges that you overcome? So understanding that where we were not only working on engagement, we were also working on telling the story of what are we promising our people, and what are the words that we need to use when we are hiring again to build that employer value proposition so that we can launch externally and tell the right story. Because the thing that you don't want to do is tell a story about an experience that doesn't exist, because you create a whole nother host of problems. There's a question: how did you relay the message to leadership through the health index, or more in depth? Yes, to all of the above. Creating summaries for that, but also verbatim. So there were, as I said, almost 100 pages of notes. We have quotes in there from people who've provided feedback. And it's really in the quotes, the actual words of people, that you get a lot of value and context for understanding the scope of what it means and how to think about their experience and sitting in their shoes.
Yeah, there's some really practical advice in there. I'm already thinking about the focus groups that I need to run. Keep them small. Consider reporting lines, and you also gave some examples of some really great questions. So I'm going to have to go back and watch this again. But previous to this chat today, Bryan, we have had another conversation. Oh, sorry, I'll lean in. My voice is too quiet back here. Another conversation around the idea of employer brand damage control, in reference, I guess, to the challenging times that we are all living in. And I'm assuming a lot of what you just talked to then does play into this philosophy. But could you just expand a little bit more on what you think around this idea of employer brand damage control?
So yeah, it's definitely overlapping with what I just talked about. Understanding damage control is first understanding the channels that people are using to talk about whatever the damage is internally, and providing them a powerful avenue to communicate that. Their concerns. So for us, it was the focus groups, but it was also in turning on a survey mechanism that now makes our organizational health index. So now we're asking people every month those specific things, and we're helping to understand. Because are y'all familiar with Net Promoter Score and employee Net Promoter Score? Yeah. So the promoter score is great. It's a standard that a lot of people are used to, but it's a positive or negative signal. Typically, it doesn't tell you what to do. It just says you're either in trouble or you're not. And that's a great indicator. But what we did was we flipped it, and we needed to understand what needs to be actioned, what needs to be changed, and how do you actually apply that based upon the people who are sharing that information with you. So that was a big part of damage control for us, is understanding that the communication channel has to be set. and it has to be a reliable, consistent communication channel. Because if it's not, you end up with people on Indeed and Glassdoor and Reddit and Blind and a whole bunch of other places talking about these things because they either don't have an outlet, or part of the damage control is that they've been a part of a reduction in force. They've left the company either voluntarily or involuntarily, and they're looking for an outlet to share those frustrations. So paying attention to the channels, understanding that you have an escalation path. So typical reputation management is that you have a series of responses to certain questions and certain issues that people bring up. You know what you can respond to, you know what you can't respond to, and you know what is actionable versus not actionable. Meaning if somebody's just complaining about something and they want to be validated or heard, great, there's a response for that. Obviously, we don't copy and paste everything, but it's understanding the channels that matter, and then also being able to actively respond to those channels. And the damage control there is twofold. It's in making sure that those answers are transparent to your internal employees so that they understand the message that you're trying to deliver. And you want to make sure that it's visible externally so that people understand how you're responding. So what you do when things go wrong is just as important as what you do to make them go right. So it's a chance to respond and to come at it with a solution. And it's all in your attitude, your tone, and how you approach that conversation. So damage control could be a lot of things. More specifically, as I was talking about it, it's a reduction in force, a restructure. It could also be mergers and acquisitions. It could also be a public relations nightmare. Somebody gets in legal trouble. It could be a lot of different factors. And one of the things that we're doing at the next the Talent Brand Summit coming up in Chicago is actually a panel dedicated specifically to people who are going through this. And so we're talking through what are the things that you do? How are you dealing with this? What toolkits did you build after having gone through this that other people should be thinking about creating? So that's the goal, is to share all that knowledge and just to say that there are a lot of people going through it, but how are they responding? And more importantly, how are they responding internally? One of my leaders asked me as we were about to go through this, they said, how do we protect our employer brand? How do we safeguard our employer brand from what we're about to go through? And my answer was simple. Provide the absolute best experience that you can for everybody who's being impacted. That is the only way to minimize the damage to your employer brand, is to spend the resources, the time, and the communications to let people understand that you are trying to help them get through this process. And it's true. I stand by it. You can't spin your way out of a bad, damaging situation for your brand. You have to fundamentally take those resources and improve the situation as much as you can. And I think that's one of the things that people don't realize, is that if you're communicating what you're doing, people get it. Like, as a mob, we get kind of crazy. But as individuals who are thinking and understanding and processing what's going on, we get that there are a lot of factors and we can process and receive information. So it's doing the thing first. So it's less about marketing and more about showing up the way that you should.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful, so much. Great advice.
And Bryan, is part of the line of thinking there from the long-term perspective is that the talent you want, when you're back in the market and you do want to bring new talent in and good talent, is that they will judge you on how you handled some of the harder times when you weren't in the market as much?
Oh, that's my favorite question now that I tell everybody to ask, is when you're in the interview process, that point when someone says, do you have any questions for me? You're like, I do. So how did you support your employees during the pandemic? Full stop. And you wait. And that goes for a restructure, that goes for a layoff, that goes for any time a brand is going through a challenging time. And 2020 was a special kind of year, y'all. It was this intersection in the US anyway. It was an intersection of a lot of civil rights and injustices, and the pandemic, and increased violence, and a whole bunch of other factors that laid on top of each other. So it's understanding that companies had to step back and ask themselves how they could support employees better, and how they were taken care of became front page news. The stories from a brand perspective became less relevant, and the stories from the employee perspective were the ones that people cared about.
Yeah, I mean, it's so much more visible now. You were saying before about the democratization of content. Every individual you're talking about, they go on Indeed and report on their experiences. It's more visible than ever. Versus, I don't know, pick a timeline, maybe 20 years ago, you could kind of just say, yeah, it's like we look after our people, and assume. You could say it, but it wasn't as easy, obviously, for candidates or talent to go and background check that so easily as it is now, right? Yeah. Cool. So we've probably got time for one or two more questions.
I reckon. Well, we've pretty much covered off topic 3 in that conversation we just had then, Bryan, around, what do you do about shifting your EB focus when you are going through a time like this? So obviously focus on the employee experience, giving them an outlet, really focusing on those channels, and making sure that you're communicating that first of all internally, but also externally. So we actually like to finish these sessions with a question from our last guest. So I do have it on a slide, Paul, but I'm a bit nervous that I think it might not play, so I might just read it out because it might be a bit clunky. So Sim, who is head of talent from Sportsbet, she asked you, what's the one piece of tech stack that you think doesn't get the credit it deserves or has untapped potential?
The one piece of the tech stack that doesn't get the credit it deserves. I'm gonna go with your career site. And so let me qualify that. So most people, they know what their career site is. They either love it or they hate it, and they usually love it for about 5 minutes after they've redone it, and then they hate it again. So the reason I think it's overlooked is that there's not the investment in really good content for the career site. We put it up, we have some words, they match our branding scheme, but we haven't put the weight into two different things. We haven't put the weight into the content, and we also haven't put the weight into looking at, in most cases, it'll be Google Analytics or the measurement behind the scenes to understand where people are coming in, how they're spending their time, and more importantly, how people are absorbing that content. How are they searching for the content? How are they finding it? And what's resonating with them? I feel like we don't do enough to understand the stories that matter most to our audiences. I feel like we're trying to have a one-to-many approach instead of focusing on our audiences and telling stories that actually are sculpted and created for the groups of people that you're trying to hire. You don't need 3,000 people to pay attention or land on a page to get 30 hires. You need, maybe 300 if they're the right people. So if you're targeting the right people and telling the right stories and investing in content creation and investing in the numbers on the back end that tell you what content is working, I think that's probably the biggest piece that I see people leaving on the table. It's back to kind of like Mad Men days. I don't know if y'all remember that old show, Mad Men?
Love Mad Men.
It was talked about that only half of advertising works, but nobody knows which half. So you have to do everything. And I think a lot of people are still living in that world today. So I don't think we need to. And I think that's one of the biggest underutilized tools in the tool belt is focusing on where that content lives and how people resonate with that content.
Yeah, amazing. We talk about that.
Sorry, my Ron Burgundy syndrome is kicking up, and I'm reading the question from CB in the chat.
I know. I saw your eyes dart
CB.
over.
I was going to say, we
Yeah.
promised that's definitely not a planted question. The mysterious CB
Yeah.
asking about video my job, but yeah, maybe Bryan, feel free to answer that. Maybe more broadly in the context of employee-generated content or video, however you want to take it.
Yeah. So your employees have more credibility than your CEO, and understanding that people view that now, that's normal. That's table stakes. I always ask, and I'm going to throw this back with a reference to the movie The Departed, and it was Alec Baldwin's question in the movie was, cui bono? Who benefits? Who benefits from the message that's being delivered? Who benefits from the story that's being told? And you know that executives are going to benefit from a message about the company being amazing. You know that they have their specific agendas, that they're trying to recruit or they're trying to sell something. You know where they're coming from. When you hear a story from an employee, you're hearing more of their reaction to it and less about what they're going to get from it. And that's the part that I love. I love being able to get those stories. And as I think about employee generated content, there are going to be more and more tools that enable that, and more tools that walk people down that path to know what a good story looks like. And I think the future is probably baked in some AI, or at least some really smart templates to walk people down a path that tell the story that matters most to their specific candidates. I think that's the question. I think the part about video is it's been democratized. It exists everywhere, and we're changing our definition for what good user-generated video content looks like. And I think that's the piece that people need to realize, is that investment in content doesn't mean I'm spending $15,000 on a video crew or more. It means I'm telling a story through the mediums that matter most to my audience.
Great.
Sounds good. Nicely handled.
Well, we're about to get kicked out of this room, so we'll have to wrap things up, Bryan, unfortunately. But I'm just going to share this last little slide here that has a QR code on there. If anyone wants the recording from today's session, if you have any guests or topics to suggest too, please scan away and give us your feedback. But mainly, we just wanted to say thank you so much for joining us today, Bryan. It was such a great conversation. We can't wait to cut it up and share it with the community and spread it far and wide. And thank you, everyone, for the questions. I'm going to go ahead and say that the best question of the day was Shalina. Is that right? Mm-hmm. What can I see? My eyesight's a bit off. So I'll get in touch via LinkedIn and post you out one of these kits so you can start using it and create your videos from anywhere. And if anyone wants to connect with Bryan, Paul will drop Bryan's LinkedIn in the chat. And yeah, just thank you again, Bryan, for joining us today. It was great.
My pleasure. Have a great rest of your day, and I will have a great evening, and I appreciate the time. Thanks, y'all.
Awesome. Thanks, guys.
Cheers.